So, I'm sure by now you've seen what's happening in the Netherlands, with the Dutch farmers basically revolting. They're blocking supermarkets, distribution centers, roads, and something that's beautifully and obviously inspired by the Canadian Freedom Convoy. But they're not big fans of this great reset that seems to be happening everywhere in the West, and they're spraying manure everywhere to let it be known, which I think is an entirely apt thing to do. And this is because the Dutch government wants to reduce emissions of nitrogen oxide and ammonia. Cuts could reach 70% in some areas under the plans, which is bad news for farmers. It's bad news for people who want food. It seems like the sort of thing that's just kind of a no-brainer for a government not to do. I'm sure you've also seen what's happening in Sri Lanka. And why are people storming the presidential palace? Well, one big thing is that the government decided that they knew more about agriculture than the farmers knew. And they decided they were going to force them to do organic farming. So what happened in Sri Lanka? Faced with a deepening economic and humanitarian crisis, Sri Lanka called off an ill-conceived national experiment in organic agriculture this winter. The Sri Lankan president promised in his 2019 election campaign to transition the country's farmers to organic agriculture over a period of 10 years. Last April, the government made good on that promise, imposing a nationwide ban on the importation and use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and ordering the country's 2 million farmers to go organic. The result was brutal and swift. Against claims that organic methods can produce comparable yields to conventional farming, domestic rice production fell 20% in just the first 6 months. Sri Lanka, long self-sufficient in rice production, has been forced to import 450 million worth of rice, even as domestic prices for this staple of the national diet surged by around 50%. The ban also devastated the nation's tea crop, its primary export and source of foreign exchange. And in November of 2021, they had to just stop this because it was a total disaster. And why did this happen in the first place? Ideology. They didn't ask the farmers. And I've shown you this guy in videos before, but it does illustrate the consequences of allowing ideologues with essentially worthless knowledge control over the people with the consequential knowledge, the knowledge that really matters, the knowledge that you would gain from, say, I don't know, a lifetime of farming. This man here is Trofim Lysenko. He was a Soviet agronomist and biologist. He rejected Mendelian genetics in favor of his own idiosyncratic pseudoscientific ideas, later termed Lysenkoism. And pseudoscientific, yeah, I think that's a term we should all be fairly familiar with now after the last few years anyway. Lysenko's ideas and practices contributed to the famines that killed millions of Soviet people. The adoption of his methods in 1958 in the People's Republic of China had similarly calamitous results, culminating in the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1962. And this is because he didn't know anything about food production or agriculture, but he was a far-left ideologue. And when far-left ideologues run into reality, well, you know what happens to reality. Lysenko forced farmers to plant seeds very close together since, according to his law of the life of species, plants from the same class never compete with one another. Yes, he was a communist. This is the way they think. And that brings us to Canada. How much do you think Trudeau knows about agriculture? I'm going to guess precisely 0. But Trudeau does appear to be an ideologue, which means that he doesn't much care for reality. And here we have the headline: Trudeau seeking to implement policy similar to that protested by Dutch farmers. Again, we're just in the middle of a global food crisis, right? What could go wrong? What could go wrong, Justin? The revolt exhibited by Dutch farmers serves as a warning sign to those in Canada for what might come if Trudeau gets his way. Over the past few weeks, farmers across the Netherlands have vehemently turned up in droves to protest the government's plan to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, arguing it would have disastrous consequences for their businesses and eventually consumers. That's right, people need food. The source of their anger is a policy that is not unlike one which Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is seeking to implement in Canada. Surprise, surprise, Trudeau's got a terrible idea. In 2020, the Liberals announced that their goal was to reduce the emissions from fertilizer by 50% over the next 8 years. Fertilizer Canada, and that's an organization that represents manufacturers and distributors of fertilizers in Canada, they slammed the government's short-sighted approach, arguing that reducing nitrogen fertilizer use, quote, will have considerable impact on Canadian farmers' incomes and reduce overall Canadian exports and GDP. Let's see, in a report, they suggested that regulated fertilizer reduction could cost Canadian farmers $48 billion by 2030 and reduce crop sizes. You remember this? Remember this article I just showed you on Sri Lanka? Remember that? It's bizarre. It's like Trudeau doesn't understand that things are going horribly wrong. Not just in Canada, in the whole world. Perhaps he should try and avoid making incredibly stupid and consequential mistakes. But I'm starting to wonder if it's not intentional, honestly. I'm not conspiracy-minded at all, but it's baffling. Anyway, as the Toronto Sun reports, fertilizer is typically the most expensive cost for farmers, and they tend to use only as much as needed. Under the plan, farmers will likely be forced to move to using costlier, greener fertilizer, which in turn translates to higher prices for consumers. Or, as in the case of Sri Lanka, the people storming the presidential palace because they're hungry. And it's amazing. This is all just in plain sight. It's in plain sight. And it kind of makes you wonder. I mean, this should be an easy mistake to avoid, right? I don't know. It's almost as if Trudeau couldn't care less what happens to Canadians. Anyway, please subscribe, like, and share. Sharing really helps me out. I notice when people share my content, makes a big difference. Thank you for doing that. I'll see you next time.